Friends and comrades, good evening and good morning, respectively those who are from North America and Western Europe and people from India and Asia. We have almost come to an end of the ongoing Ambedkar lecture series taught by comrade Geetha for almost a month. It is a great beginning for most of us, those who are reading Ambedkar already and those who are interested to read Ambedkar. Her introduction gives us to comprehend and conceptualize Ambedkar works. Comrade Geetha not only clearly and detailedly giving introduction about Ambedkar work in historical context, but also she explained some of the very complex disposition of Dr. Ambedkar in social, political, and economical positions. We have one more session, that is the final session, that will be on Wednesday evening US time, that is Thursday morning India time, and that will be our final session for this series. Today's lecture is Brahmanism and Annihilation of Caste, which is I feel very interesting and most exciting after reading around 80 pages in Buddha and his Dhamma and other works. Dr. Ambedkar embraced Buddhism on 14th October 1956, that is 6 weeks before his demise. He became a Bodhisattva. Perhaps he might have been already a Bodhisattva, but officially he became Bodhisattva on October 14th of 1956. And that is significant because that is a mass conversion. Around 380,000 people embraced Buddhism with Dr. Ambedkar. Important questions are why Dr. Ambedkar has to embrace Buddhism. Can we annihilate caste without a religious conversion? Whether that religion is with God or without God, because Buddhism does not accept God and soul. Can't an individual decastify her, them, or himself without religious conversion? Are all the Buddhists free from the caste prejudice, even those who are following the Ambedkar's version of Buddhism, that is Neo-Buddhism and Navayana Buddhism? Or despite the Hinduism philosophically upholds the system of great inequality, other religions in India is not from the caste practices. They are not completely free from caste practices. So these are the questions that most of us have, and you may have a different question too. To make an attempt to find the answer, we have to understand what is the core vision of Dr. Ambedkar about society. In my opinion, core vision of Dr. Ambedkar about society is that he tried to realize a society is a democratic society, which is based on equality, liberty, and fraternity. Of three of them, Ambedkar sees that fraternity is the root of democracy. He goes on writes that the society which is bereft of or lack of fraternity, even there is the equality and liberty, they will destroy each other. And also he writes, the democratic society is a prerequisite of the democratic government. And he says that if there is a democratic government in the undemocratic society, such a governments will be toppled. And these are the so many explanations Ambedkar gives. And throughout his life, Ambedkar worked on this very idea of a democratic society and democracy, and he enriched it. The famous text, which is very close to us or very familiar to each of us, is Annihilation of Caste, where he defines that democracy is not merely a form of a government, but it is an associated mode of living, experience of conjoined experiencing conjoined communication. And it is the attitude of respect and reverence to a fellow man. And this is what Ambedkar defines. And he did not stop there, and he goes on to extend and says it is a philosophy of life. But before that, he adds that democracy is more than a political mission, even more than a social system. It is an attitude of mind or a philosophy of life. So this is where Ambedkar linked this idea of philosophy and Buddhism into his core vision. And Ambedkar found that Buddhism, which emphasis on fraternity, will be a means to annihilate caste by upholding very fraternity. More importantly, during his conversion, Ambedkar rejected the Buddhism of its traditional forms, that is Mahayana, Rajayana, and Theravada Buddhism, and he introduced his own branch of Buddhism called the Navayana Buddhism, what we know as a Neo-Buddhism, and that is where I would like to end my comment, and I would like to request Comrade Geetha to resume her lecture. Thank you all.
Karthik. And we, as Karthik said, we're almost at the end of this lecture series, and I must say it's been very thought-provoking and inspiring to be in conversation with a whole lot of people whom I personally don't know, but we've all been drawn together by our deep interest in Baba Saheb's thought world. So today I intend to focus on the Buddha and his Dhamma, but we need to get there first. So I might perhaps start on talking about the text, but we'll probably have to take it up in detail on Thursday. So I want to sort of, as always, just go back a little bit and do a very, very quick sort of bird's eye view of what we've looked at throughout these lectures. One is, of course, we have tried to grasp the important details and constituents of Ambedkar's thought world in terms of the ideas that he put together, but also in terms of all that he did practically in the public sphere, in a political context, in a social context. And we've tried to sort of understand how practice and concept went together, how the one enriched the other, and how it was important for Ambedkar to keep that tension between ideas and practice and not resolve one in favor of the other, because Ambedkar was essentially a very open-minded man, and he did not think that any particular position that he had worked out had to be taken as fixed and given. And as he said towards the end of his life in one of the lectures that he gave to students, the nature of oppression, suffering, and the problems that the Indian social order comprises, no one way of looking at things might suffice. So one needs to sort of come to put together different ways of annihilating caste, of working for equality, of working for justice, for realizing fraternity. This does not mean he was eclectic, but he was trying to work through a system of thought and a system of political action, of social practice that would answer to all the sorts of inequalities that he had worked very hard at defining and holding up to the Indian social order. So very quickly, we were to sort of look at the sort of work that he began right from his student days. One is, of course, what I called work at creating a very distinctive vocabulary of oppression in the Hindu social order, to do with caste, to do with the nature of caste society, which he, of course, brilliantly defined as sustained by graded inequality. But the key words here are, of course, an ascending scale of reverence and a descending scale of contempt, which I think is unmatched to this day in the sense that it gives us of caste society. The other is, of course, the definition of untouchability as apartness, the untouchables as a part apart, linked to the caste system, but also kept outside of it. So that's one set of definitions. The second is what sustains the caste order. And I think unlike almost all theorists of his time, Ambedkar paid attention to what feminists call the sphere of reproduction, of how that sphere is enclosed, fortified, how at the very heart of intimacy there is apartness, and that is where caste actually is anchored and nurtured and given space and built up and so on. So I think the attention he paid to the linking of caste and gender, to the status of women and the construction of caste identities. This is a very, very important insight, and a lot more thought and action ought to have been given to this aspect of the caste order and untouchability. But except for gesturing towards the importance of intercaste marriages, very little work has been done in thinking about what ought to be the larger culture within which we can rethink relationships of intimacy and affection and so on. So I think that's a question that we will come back to when we look at fraternity and the Buddha and this Dhamma. What is a larger culture of social relationships, of individual relationships that ought to sustain a different sense of the domestic, a different sense of the intimate. So that's a second set of definitions Ambedkar worked with. The third, of course, has to do with the manner in which this form of social reproduction has been continuously reproduced. The reproduction of the systems of reproduction, and not only of production. And here Ambedkar set great store by understanding what he called Brahmanism. And we all looked at the triumph of Brahmanism as a text. which helps us place Brahmanism in a historical context. We also looked at the modern avatars, if you like, of Brahmanism, especially when we looked at Brahmanism and nationalism in the Indian context. How for Ambedkar, nationalism was still a project in the making, that it could never be complete unless you challenged and annihilated caste and untouchability. But meanwhile, how nationalism could speak with the voice of Brahmanism. So this is also something that Ambedkar and of course the other thinkers within the anti-caste tradition have pointed this out. One of the earliest was Pandita Ayotidas, Periyar also, how Brahmanism and nationalism were actually sort of joined at the hip, so to speak, in the late colonial and modern India. So this also we looked at, and we looked at the nature of Brahmanism from an entirely different aspect as well, from the point of view of charisma of Gandhi and his role in the national movement, and how Ambedkar argued that Gandhi's way of looking at things, Gandhism, if you like, was a form of counter-revolution in the modern period. We also considered all of that. And then Ambedkar's ideas on caste and the economic order, the nature of labor in caste society, and how stigmatized labor does not secrete value, and how more generally within the caste order, labor does not secrete value. And what does this mean in terms of the economics of caste society? What does it mean for the worker's sense of self, for proletarian consciousness? And we sort of looked at all of that over the last two lectures. So you have an entirely new vocabulary, and Ambedkar attempts to sort of link all of these together, not in a systematic philosophical way, but whenever he had the opportunity and time to work through systems of thought, he does give us a way in which we see how all these things are held together, and how one cannot just address one of these strands without simultaneously addressing the other. So any attempt at addressing, say, the agrarian servitude of Dalits in a political economy of rural India must at the same time challenge the customs and the ideas which sustain this agrarian servitude. And I also suggested that the greatest victory, say, of the Indian left have been precisely in those contexts where servitude, class conflict, and the addressing of the cultures of caste and religion which keep this conflict in place, where these were addressed simultaneously, the Indian left was very successful. So, and Ambedkarite movement also, in a very deep sense, wherever it had sought to bring these two things together, it made for a very distinctive kind of challenge to the Indian ruling system, the Indian ruling classes and ruling ideologies. So these are some of the things we've been looking at. Now I want to sort of go back and pick the one important strand that we have seen as running through Ambedkar's thought world from the very beginning, from caste in India, but more particularly from his writings and submissions during the 1920s, which is that Ambedkar, for all the work that he sought to do in the civil realm, the civil rights struggles that he led, whether it was the Mahat Satyagraha or the Parvati Devi Satyagraha, or the Kalaram Temple Satyagraha, those are the civil rights struggles that he was a part of, or the political struggles to secure for the Dalits separate electorates, for Dalits to be a part of the state, for their presence in the bureaucracy, in education. So that's another set of struggles. Then looking at Dalit presence in the political world and as part of state making from the prism of labor, the setting up of the Independent Labour Party. And later on, even when he founded the Scheduled Caste Federation, you find that he looks at the whole business of Dalits being active in political life and in state making from the point of view of Dalits as laborers. You see that as well in the manifesto of the Scheduled Caste Federation through the 50s and the late 40s and 50s. So in the course of all these struggles that he was part of and that he initiated, and to which he sought to bring Dalits and wherever possible, those we call the non-Brahmins and the peasants and the workers, you see that he's always, he has this lingering sense of this might not be enough, that political struggles waged in the domain of economics, and we saw how he even says, I will put aside the struggle for untouchability if this will bring together peasants and Dalits during the anti-court struggle. So he sees that certain sorts of back and forth movement is required if one were to build a kind of class consciousness. And even if one were to build a national consciousness, one has to move back and forth between these various realms. But you also find him feeling there's a lingering sense of how none of these struggles can be complete unless we question the fundamentals of how various aspects of the society we call the Hindu social order relate to each other. And that relationship is not simply between different castes, but it's also at a very human level of human interaction between a Dalit in a village, in a context, and a person who is not a Dalit in a village and a context. Because ultimately for Ambedkar, the test of emancipation was the flowering of human capacities, the richness of human capacities that, interestingly, Marx also calls attention to in the manifesto, in the economic and philosophic manuscripts. So it is that richness of human capacities, the liberation, the emancipation of these capacities from all that trammels them. So for Ambedkar, that trammeling happens at the level of human relationships itself. So he has this sort of lingering sense that that has to be addressed on its own terms. And as I have pointed to several times in my presentations, his first indication of what is at stake is, of course, the Southborough Commission's submission, where he speaks of the Dalit as having his very or her very personhood confiscated. And then when he submits and speaks before the Simon Commission, he speaks of how you cannot make one human being love another human being through law or through the institution of political protocols and arrangements. And then again, when you see him at the Roundtable Conference, you see Ambedkar's sort of insisting that any action that you take to affirm the rights of the untouchables, whether in the economic, political, or social spheres, that has to be accompanied by conscious, proactive state action. And of course, what he's telling us is that you need to have a constitutional mandate, provision by which the state feels charged to act on the behalf of the Dalits, of the untouchables. And that constitutional mandate that the state ought to give itself is what, of course, Ambedkar would later on struggle to put into the Constitution of Free India, a constitution for Free India in the Constituent Assembly debates. And then when you come to the 40s and when you look at a text like States and Minorities, which he submitted to the Committee on Fundamental Rights as part of the Constituent Assembly proceedings, you see that once again Ambedkar is concerned about the ethical core of the society by which we will all be mandated to constitute our public lives, at least, if not our private lives. So there's this lingering sense that you need something more than law, and perhaps you can inscribe that something, that call for an ethical self-making within the Constitution itself. You have that sense in Ambedkar. You also have that sense of how you need to develop constitutional morality. And that is, of course, there in his famous Constituent Assembly speeches. You also find that that's what he's gesturing towards in all of the debates that he participates in the Constituent Assembly. And that is what is writ large in the Hindu Code Bill debates as well, when he tries to form a code, a digest of Hindu law that would help us rethink relationships in the domestic and the sphere of reproduction, so to speak. So that morality that he was hinting at, which he calls constitutional morality, that becomes a very important subject of almost all his public talks in the post-independent period. And there are two things that he keeps calling attention to if we want to remain a democratic state, because one of the things that Ambedkar keeps telling us is it's not enough to be a democratic polity, and as Karthik also pointed out, we need to be a democratic society. But he also wants us to reflect on how are we going to continue to remain a democratic polity. And he has a lot to say about what could come by way of anarchism, of violence, of authoritarian compulsions that will destroy our democratic polity. And to sustain the democratic polity, you need to have a democratic society. So he talks of the importance of constitutional morality and of public conscience. And this is a very important aspect of Ambedkar's thought, that you need to develop and sustain public conscience. And in the 1950s, in 1954 to be precise, his Rajya Sabha address on the report that is submitted by the Commissioner for the Scheduled Caste, he says that it's not enough to just list atrocities or to say that the law will take its course, but how are you going to charge the public with developing a sense of public conscience whenever such an atrocity happens? And how are the public going to feel inflamed and angered that such things exist? And how will they then say that we will not put up with this? So Ambedkar is very concerned about what he calls the ethical or the moral order of society. And he sort of argues from within British liberal thought, but takes it to a completely other domain by saying that you need to sort of therefore have a sense of the ethical to sustain a sense of the democratic. Whether class consciousness or national consciousness on their own can achieve the ethical, he's not sure. Because in caste society, both the nation and class, especially the proletarian class consciousness that is necessary to challenge the social and economic orders, he feels these are far too suffused with a sense of religion, with a sense of caste. So his concern with left politics has always been this, that while yes, we could come together as proletarians, who will then take on the task of building this proletarian consciousness by challenging religion, by challenging the caste order itself, by challenging graded inequality, by challenging the sense of apartness, of the social odium and social nausea that untouchability connotes as far as the caste Hindu is concerned. So he is concerned about working together to challenge this, but who is to do this working together and what will challenge this? And how much can you rely on state structures? After having worked all his life for Dalits to be part of these state structures, and no doubt that Dalit presence in Indian political life has been extremely consequential. It has, even in its darkest moments, it has the darkest moments of the Indian state, it has helped to push certain sorts of justice agendas. For example, I'm thinking here of the making of the Prevention of Atrocities Against Scheduled Castes and Scheduled Tribes, 1989. This was done at one of the darkest hours of Indian democratic existence, at a time when when the Indian state was carrying out an extremely authoritarian policy in the Punjab, causing the disappearance of hundreds, if not thousands, of young men of the kind that you shudder to think of now. But that was precisely the time when the same Home Minister, Bhutta Singh, who presided over these happenings, whether he consented, whether he opposed, we'll never know entirely. But this was the same Home Minister who also consented to the passing of the Atrocities Act. So I think there is something to be thought through there. What has Dalit presence in political life and state life achieved for us? It has not achieved fundamental transformations. Dalit presence in all political parties, including the Hindu right, including parties which support the Hindu right. What has it translated substantially in terms of practice? These are issues that we still continue to debate, despair over. But certainly Dalit presence in political and state life have been very consequential in the Indian social context. But having said that, Ambedkar would want us to ask a further question. Does it therefore mean that we need to sort of work with state structures alone, or do we need to do something else, something more? And for him here, the institution of a complex moral order would be a very important aspect of the work that we do to annihilate caste, to repossess the state. And that work has to be done both at the realm of public action, whether we strive to build working class parties or we strive to build democratic, broadly based democratic parties. That work can never cease to be. This is something Ambedkar would charge us with doing. And here I want to step back and look at how did he see this working. And I think this work has many aspects to it, and I think it's an important thing to reflect on some of these aspects. I have touched upon them earlier too, but basically it involves a struggle against what Ambedkar would call Brahmanism and Hinduism. And I think the struggle against Hinduism is very, very important because Hinduism, as Ambedkar would be the first one to tell us, has never been one thing. It has existed in different avatars, it has had different historical forms. And I think more than ever, it's important to ask this question because constantly there are attempts made to appropriate Ambedkar to the Hindu nationalist context, to the cause of a Rashtriya Hinduism. And that happens all the time, and we've seen it happening even during this extremely acute moment of suffering, of COVID, and of the kinds of things we've seen happening around us in India. And I think we need to understand why this agenda was for Ambedkar, therefore very important to challenge Hinduism and all attempts to think of Dalit emancipation from within a Hindu context. And Ambedkar's struggle with Hinduism was both an internal struggle as well as an external struggle, because Ambedkar knew Hinduism from its core principles. He was familiar with its philosophical traditions. And through the 1920s, you see him trying to see if one could redeem Hinduism by pointing to the principles that sustain it, to its philosophical traditions, by pointing to how practice and philosophy are completely different in Hinduism, and how can Hindus put up with this sort of, let's call it social schizophrenia, where you sort of celebrate its philosophical advances while you do very little to realize what he called Brahmaism, or the oneness that Brahmaism gestures towards in practice. At one point, he even calls Shankara a Buddhist. So Ambedkar sort of tries to work with these aspects of Hinduism, but again, he's not sure at all that those can be sustained, because the way Hindus think about Hinduism, caste Hindus think about Hinduism, is very different from Ambedkar's own sense of what this could be. And so you find him waging a very critical battle against the Hindu Mahasabha throughout the 1920s in Maharashtra and into the 1930s. You find them waging a battle with Gandhism and its praise of Varnashrama Dharma and its refusal to countenance civil and social rights for the Dalits. Ambedkar's famous letter to A.V. Thakkar as to what he expected the Harijan Sevak Sangh to do, which was sadly unanswered. So Ambedkar was uneasy with Hinduism, which unease is of course writ very large in the Annihilation of Caste. And that unease translates in the mid-30s into his rejection of Hinduism as a creed for himself personally and for Dalits certainly, and for whoever else wants to challenge caste and to annihilate caste and untouchability. So I think the movement that he essays from the mid-1930s, for all the battles he tries to wage from within a Hindu philosophical context, not that he identifies himself as a Hindu ever, but he does wish to give a historical opportunity and chance for the Hindu traditions to redeem themselves. And he does that even in Annihilation of Caste. Even as he addresses the Arya Samaj and challenges Varnashrama Dharma, he says, should you want to reform yourself, do so within the context of liberty, equality, and fraternity. But that giving a historical opportunity for Hinduism is completely annulled for him from the mid-30s. And as you see him through his writings of the mid-1940s, all those writings that are there in volume 7, in Revolution and Counter-Revolution, in volume 3 of the collected works, you see that he is very decisively breaking with even those philosophical traditions he thought ought to be given a historical chance, a historical opportunity to redeem themselves through practice, through insisting on Sangatan, through insisting on the unity of various castes and the ending of untouchability and so on. But from the mid-1930s, that is a no-no for him. And the most definite announcement of his decision to not engage with Hinduism in that manner, but to engage instead in a very founded historical and philosophical critique, is that classic address that he made in 1936 in Dadar in Bombay, in a meeting of the Mahars, what path to salvation, what way to emancipation. It's been translated in different ways, which I think is a forerunner of many of the subjects he would explore in Revolution and Counter-Revolution, in Philosophy of Hinduism, in his latter day essays on untouchability. So basically, that is a sort of announcement as to why Hinduism is completely unsustainable as a source of morality, of ethics, that you cannot hope to build yourself into a fraternal society if you choose to remain within the Hindu fold. Now, while that is addressed to the Mahars, that is also an address that serves notice on the Hindu social order, as Ambedkar himself would say. It's an address that serves notice on all of us, um, who are, whose forefathers and foremothers were part of Ambedkar's context, and on all of us today who still want to imagine that one could sort of work within the Hindu context and separate it from Hindutva. And while Ambedkar doesn't assimilate Hinduism to the political project of Hindutva entirely, he would want us to constantly reflect on what is this thing called Hinduism, and whether we want to stay within it as believers or non-believers. You are born into a default setting in the Indian legal context, whether you want to announce yourself to be a non-Hindu, a non-believer, or whatever else. Because to be part of Hinduism for Ambedkar was to be complicit with the caste order. And I think, therefore, he would want us all to make our positions very clear. And what path to salvation is a question that he leaves open. For himself, he would, of course, choose Buddhism, and to anyone else who wish to convert along with him. But he does leave us with that question of, if you wish to anchor fraternal social life in this subcontinental culture on a different basis, what are you going to be doing about it? Is it enough for us to build parties of labor? How would you instill a different kind of consciousness in those that constitute these parties of labor? How would you instill a different sort of democratic consciousness, democracy as a way of living, which, as John Dewey said, has to sort of work at every level, from the family to the local society to the cooperative you're a part of? If that has to work, what is the sort of ethics that you will simultaneously, concomitantly build into these structures that you're a part of? And I think that the ethical mandate that he wants us to take on is something that he leaves Dalits with the enormous responsibility of building that ethical mandate for themselves, and thereby existing as an ethical collective which serves notice on Hindu society, pushes it to sort of rethink its own options. Now, it is not an option that Ambedkar would see as only limited to Dalits alone, because as Ambedkar never failed to remind us, as long as you're part of caste society, you will have to take responsibility for caste as a relationship, not simply for caste as identity. That I will improve myself, I will better myself. That is an important part of fighting against caste. But an equally important part is to attend to the nature of relationships that are constituted by the caste order and untouchability, and to remake those relationships. So conversion is both a call for self-making, self-cultivation, for rethinking one's inner ethical life, but it's a rethinking that, while it is a rethinking for Dalits in 1936-37 and later on, it is also a rethinking for the rest of us in terms of how we look upon conversion. What do we do with this enormously historically decisive act that took place on October 14, 1956? How do we as the rest of society look upon that act of conversion? So that's the charge he's actually laid on us. That's the historical charge he's laid on us. And it is from there that I want to come to the Buddha and his Dhamma, because what did he want to do with the Buddha and his Dhamma? That's the question I want to come to. But before that, I just want to sort of round off this part of my presentation by saying that Ambedkar's decision to convert in the 1930s and the 20-year gap that he took to convert was, of course, spent in many different kinds of political and public activism, not least of all his labors in the Constituent Assembly, and the making of the Indian Constitution, his work with the Hindu Code Bill. And I think these experiences were very central to Ambedkar's sense of the ethical mandate that he wished to sort of set for the Indian social order, because the struggle in the Constituent Assembly, a struggle we must not take lightly. The amount of work that had to be done to convince the large community of politically minded Hindus, many of whom were not right-wing, some of whom were supportive of Ambedkar, even during the Hindu Code debates. Now, these that experience in talking about what it takes to endorse democracy in a substantive sense. And Ambedkar had to fight extremely hard. And perhaps that made him realize that the constitutional morality he wished to sort of cultivate and build in and through the constitution, if it has to be sustained, another battle was required. And that battle will take place on the terrain of politics. It will necessarily have to take place in the terrain of economics, which is why he charged the state with taking on a socialist mandate. Whether this state that emerged in independent India could or would do it is a different matter. And we can go on talking about the Nehruvian state and what it achieved and did not achieve. That's not something I can get into now. And whether the state as it exists today is something we can charge with any kind of mandate, ethical or constitutional or political. And what do we need to do with the state as it exists today? That's another set of questions. But I think in Ambedkar's own context, his time in the Constituent Assembly and the Hindu Code Bill debates and as law minister pointed out the essential limits of lawmaking, legislation, and state building to him. Not that therefore one ought to give up on any of these activities, but for Ambedkar himself, it was important to rethink, step back, and ask questions about how do we then build a democratic counterpoint that would help us keep the state and polity democratic in the very wide sense that he understood that democracy, economic, political, and social. So you find him therefore turning to questions of an ethical import. And I think the conversion when it happened, and it's a very long process by which he comes to conversion, and that history becomes very interesting from the 1940s onwards when he's engaged with Buddhism in a very substantive sense. And I was very sort of both happy to notice and interested that when he comes to Madras presidency in the 1940s, when he's still in the labor minister in the Viceroy's cabinet, and he speaks at many places in Chennai. And one of the places, the Scheduled Caste Federation invites him, and Sivaraj presides over the meeting. And one of the things that happens there is a young artist presents him with a drawing of the Buddha. So clearly, Buddhism was being discussed widely within the Scheduled Caste Federation. And Ambedkar himself, of course, travels quite a lot in the 1940s to various Buddhist countries. He goes to Sri Lanka, he goes to Burma, he visits Nepal. He participates in a lot of Buddhist conclaves across South Asia, including Burma, if you include Burma amongst the South Asian countries he visited. So his understanding of Buddhism in the modern context was already on the anvil through the 1940s. And he speaks of it in different ways, in different places. In Sri Lanka, he has a different theme. He speaks of how he wants to understand what the bhikkhus are doing and what he thinks they ought to do. Likewise, when he goes to Burma, he notices what the bhikkhus are up to. He perhaps was familiar with the sort of drawing together of socialism and Buddhism and the thought of the Burmese Socialist Party. Perhaps he was familiar with those arguments. He certainly was familiar with the arguments that a certain section of the Trotskyite left was making in Sri Lanka about putting together the principles of Buddhism and socialism. And when he's charged to speak in Nepal before his conversion, he does speak of Buddhism and socialism, which then becomes Buddha or Karl Marx. And I looked at that text in my last presentation. So there's a great deal that he's doing, talking about Buddhism in many forums, in Dalit forums, in world forums, before students. So he is definitely sort of telling us something about how, in as much as he thinks socialism is important, that socialism has to take on board what he thinks is the ethical and philosophical lessons of Buddhism. And which is of course stated very clearly in the Buddha Karl Marx. But I think it's also a larger theme that he will bring into the Buddha and his Dhamma. The shadow of Marx pursues Ambedkar in the Buddha and his Dhamma in more ways than one, and we will see exactly how, hopefully in the concluding lecture. But here I want us to ask the question, what did Ambedkar hope to do by writing Buddha and his Dhamma? And I think it's an important question because it certainly is not a so-called catechism for the masses who are going to convert, because Buddha and his Dhamma is in English, and it's not very, one can safely say that of the 3.8 million people who converted in 1956, not very many of them would have been able to read English. Likewise, the majority of his Dalit constituency, or even the caste Hindus who supported him, like say in the Madras presidency, not many of them would have been familiar with the English language at that point in time. So the Buddha and his Dhamma then has to be read as a text which is presented to the world at large, including the world of caste Hindus, the world of socialists, the world of historians, for us, all of us, to sit back and take note of what Ambedkar wants us to understand by Navayana Buddhism. And why does he want the world to take note of this very interesting piece of writing that he has put together through the 40s, which has gone through several versions, and which bears the imprint of deep Buddhist learning. There's this wonderful annotated edition that Akash Singh Rathore has put out, Buddha and his Dhamma. And before that, you have Christopher Emmerich and others who've annotated this text for us by pointing to all the source material that Ambedkar used. And Rathore actually shows how within the same section, Ambedkar sort of has recourse to different kinds of source material. And he raises the question, why did Ambedkar choose this source for this incident and that source for that incident? So it's a very carefully, the point I'm trying to make is, it's a text that has been very carefully put together. And Ambedkar wasn't fully satisfied with it. We know that he wanted to rework it, as he often did all the texts before they went to went out for publication. But he was also very conscious of time running out for him. And he wanted to sort of therefore have this text out while he was still well, while his mental capacities were still very strong and alert. And I think therefore the manner in which he tried to get this text out before he was, you know, completely unwell. And I think this is a very poignant, moving thing that he has left behind as a legacy. And I think for those of us who keep asking, why did he convert? Why did he think Buddhism was an answer to caste? Why did he think that things would change, that caste would be annihilated? I think perhaps we should ask another set of questions altogether. What has he left us with? What did he want us to do with this text? What did he want us to notice in our reading of this text? What did he want us to understand of the relationship between ethics, politics, and economics? And let's remember that this ethics has been central to the very long history of socialism as well. Engels might have dismissed the viability of what the utopian socialists did, but neither Marx nor Engels took their efforts as useless. The ethical core at the heart of socialism is what has always drawn an entire tradition of intellectuals and thinkers and activists to socialism. I don't think people became Marxists after reading Capital. There's always been this sort of being drawn to this project because at its core, it is ethical. It is making a case for justice, for the good society, for the untrammeled flowering of human capacities, for social affection and fraternity. So when Marx says, I want a society where you can be a carpenter by night and a musician by day, or whatever it is, he wants us all to be, it is about the richness of our human capacity to be many things. And for Ambedkar equally, it was this capacity that each of us has as an individual that had to flower. Never mind if you're a worker in a field or in a factory, or you're a Dalit laborer in a situation of servitude. This capacity is what binds us together as human beings. And I think he wants us to read the Buddha and his Dhamma as a text that opens out the world of this inner capacity that all of us has, and therefore model our political, ethical, and economic action keeping this in mind. Because what is the Dhamma after all at the end of the day? When you look at the Buddha and his Dhamma, the Dhamma is something that constitutes you as a human being who will be mindful of the existence of other human beings. As Ambedkar never failed to point out, Buddhism teaches you to think not about the relationship between human beings and God, not about the relationship of the human being to his or her own soul, but of human beings in relationship to each other. So I think the Buddha and this Dhamma is a text of which we should ask other questions. What does it have to say about ethics? What does it have to say about what else needs to be done apart from what we all are willing to do in the economic and political realms? to rethink the nature of inequality, injustice, and to challenge this very fundamental sense of contempt. Let's not forget that Ambedkar leaves us with very powerful words. This society is based on contempt. This society is based on nausea, on hatred, on odium. And we've seen a lot of that through our various points in modern Indian history, not least of all what we are witness to in India today during the time of COVID. The the manner in which a section of Indian society is unable to imagine what it means to be poor, what it means to be without a job, what it means to suffer, what it means to be a sanitary laborer working at the height of this crisis, and how a vast section of the society is just willing to cover behind the idea of a lockdown, not even willing to sort of think through what this means for a huge section of Indian society. So how do we understand this? And to understand our incapacity for fellow feeling as a society, we need to sort of therefore go back and look at this very important text that Ambedkar has left us with, a text for an ethical revolution, which will sort of also be simultaneously a socialist revolution, a democratic revolution. And this is a text that I think he wants us to take seriously. We can, of course, and for Ambedkar to take a text seriously is to not just read it, but to argue with it, to think along with it, to submit it to reflection. And that's what we probably need to do. And we will look at the key aspects of this text in my concluding lecture. But with this caveat in mind, that Ambedkar's efforts at trying to sort of push Indian socialism, Indian communists to rethink class caste, to push state-making efforts. Now, none of these are, of course, complete in themselves. And to possess the state alone cannot be a solution. To sort of constantly think about caste and class alone is not going to be a solution. He realized that with the Labour Party, he could only do so much. But at the same time, these are all necessary efforts. So it doesn't mean that one can give up on these efforts entirely, but what else would one need to do along with these efforts, and as seriously? State building, building a party of labor, but equally importantly, how do you build the resources for the good ethical life? And I think I leave you with that. And I do hope that all of us can stay together when we discuss Buddha and his Dhamma on Thursday. And thank you, AKSC, for giving me this opportunity. Question time.